It's 4:30, and if it suits everybody else here, then we're going to lead off with the last session of the day, which is a panel discussion on the Russian reset. Putin returns. And we have an outstanding panel here to discuss this subject, led by Christian Schmidt, Parliamentary State Secretary to the Federal Minister of Defense of Germany, Lilia Shevtsova, Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment Moscow, and then Artyom Malgin, who is the Vice Rector of the Department of International Relations and Russian Foreign Policy at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, and then Bobo Lo, who is an independent scholar and consultant and the author of 3 of the finest books on Russia published in the past decade. Now, our panelists are going to be speaking initially with comments of up to 10 minutes each. Then we're going to open up the discussion to questions and answers. But first of all, up on the screen, we're honored to have a video comment from Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former United States National Security Advisor. So if we could have the video at this point, please.
Good day. Good day. Let me greet the participants in the Riga conference of 2012. I participated in that conference back in 2006, and I recall that it was a wide-ranging, very constructive, very incisive, and a very impressive discussion. So I wish I could be with you, but with the modern age being what it is, I can participate from afar and at least send you my greetings and share one basic thought regarding the relationship between Europe and Russia, and of course, in a sense, more specifically, between Latvia as a member of Europe and Russia, because I know that this will be a significant part of your discussion in the conference. If I was taking part in it, what I would have said to the participants is essentially this: that in thinking of the relationship with Russia, one has to have both a short time frame in mind and a longer one as well. And the two relate to each other in what might be said as somewhat dialectical fashion. The short one is ambiguous, to some extent even gives grounds for concern. But in the long run, I feel very confident in saying that the prospects for a constructive relationship with Russia are going to be improving in the longer run, because I believe firmly that Russia will be experiencing in the last decade or two further, but perhaps even more basic political transformation than what it has already experienced. Today we have, of course, in power in Russia a president who in many respects is rather nostalgic about the Soviet era. He wishes the Soviet Union still would exist. He once described, and mind you, he was speaking of the 20th century, a century of 2 world wars and the Holocaust and mass murders. He once said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the most regrettable event in the course of the entire century. And he is now propagating, as we all know, the notion of a Eurasian Union emerging on much of the territory of the former Soviet Union. There is a certain element of historical nostalgia, but more importantly, of strategic unreality in that kind of a view, because it is divorced not only from current circumstances, but even more so from the likely future circumstances. The fact of the matter is that Russia, to be successful itself in the long run, has to become more closely associated with Europe, because otherwise the combination of an increasingly empty territory, population decline, brain drain abroad, and an economy which in the most important sectors of technology and industry is stagnant, but is totally dependent on the export of energy, much of which then goes into private pockets and is then redeployed back to the West. That is not a condition that can endure indefinitely. Moreover, very few of the former members of the Soviet Union will wish to be truly members of a new Eurasian Union, which is a slightly altered name for the former Soviet Union. So his perspective on the future, I think, is really not based on realistic calculations. But for the moment, he's dominant, and for the moment, it is important to deal with him in a responsible fashion. And so I favor, for example, the reset policy between the United States and Russia, provided that reset policy remains sensitive to the security interests of the eastern members of NATO. But beyond that, we have to be also cognizant of the fact that there is social change in Russia that is much more hopeful. Even though Putin dominates the political scene, there's something very important about the way he is viewed by the Russians that underlines how different the reality of Russia already is. He is the first all-powerful leader of Russia who's not feared. If anything, he's increasingly ridiculed, laughed at for some of his personal stunts. And the absence of fear in the Russian political process is a sign of something far more basic, of a change in the political culture, and is associated with the growing influence in Russia of a new, more Western-oriented middle class, thousands and tens of thousands of whom have studied in the West, hundreds of thousands of whom travel to the West, and most of whom partake of the Western lifestyle and increasingly Western political aspirations. So my view of Russia in the longer run is something much more hopeful, namely of a Russia that will become increasingly tied to Europe, and that will of course have to be preceded by even closer links between Ukraine and the West, with Ukraine at the same time remaining on a positive relationship with Russia. That is the perspective I have. That is a perspective which of course is subject to debate and discussion, but my sense is that one can look forward to a period in history in which the fundamental political gap that separated the West from the East when talking of Eurasia will be closing, and that Russia itself will eventually become a much more successful and important partner of the West in building a new West with far greater ambitions and opportunities at a time in the world in which such larger scale cooperation is absolutely essential if we are to avoid growing international turmoil, regional conflicts, a variety of problems which the West and the East in the past have never faced and which in the future they'll have to address together. So I wish you a very successful meeting, and I wish I could be with you.
Dr. Brzezinski, for a very fine and thought-provoking scene-setting remarks there. I think a certain dissonance between the long-term optimism that he expresses for Russia and the short-term problems that he sees there in its political system and leadership. Now, so Russian reset. So we've got Vladimir Putin 2.0. It's got a bigger screen, improved battery life, a stronger case, and an intelligent assistant that can answer all your questions in the negative. But I think the notes to this panel discussion raise a lot of the questions that I think one inevitably brings up when considering Russia, which are primarily those of rule of law, economic growth, and whether there is latent popular unrest which eventually will explode. Those are questions which come round and round again, but there's also, I think, a more specific question which is there implicitly in what Dr. Brzezinski was saying, and which I'd like to leave hanging in the air as we move on to our panelists' opening remarks, which is, to put it very plainly, whether Putin is back now to do something new, or whether he's come back to do more of the same. So, Christian Schmidt, if you'd like to lead off.
Thank you. That's a very complicated question to answer because it's oriented into the future, and future normally is very difficult to predict. But if you allow just looking what has been and what is the past, so we have to state that unfortunately the development, be it the society in Russia, be it in politics, has not seen from the Western side, if we would take a kind of improvement in the level of coordination and cooperation and preparedness to answer joint crisis situations all over the world. Would like to refer to Syria then a little bit. I don't know when exactly, I don't remember, but in the 18th century, there is has written a French author a description about the Russians and the Germans and the French, starting with the French as the cultivated people, coming to the Germans as the half-cultivated people, and ending with the Russians as non-that cultivated people. So I would not see that we should come back to this, because it is about stereotypes and about prejudices which we cannot continue. It is what Dr. Brzezinski said, to be heard, that there is some sentimental remembrance to the times, the good old big times of Soviet Union, and we can see this in some structures around the governing party and the youth organizations and some other commitments. But today we have also to see that the society in Russia has a dramatic change. I do not want just to fix it on Pussy Riot. I don't know whether I really, with all kinds of performance of Pussy Riot, I really would agree on and take this as a higher level of culture. But nevertheless, we see that there is a civil society developing and being prepared to answer some authoritarian reflexes we see in now in the government or in the presidency. And if you accept, just remembering that I had the honor with the group, together with Dr. Brzezinski, having been invited with the predecessor as president of President Putin, Medvedev, in his dacha beyond diplomatic approach. We got the impression this is the new future Russia of the 21st century, not of the 20th century. We all know how complicated it is to fix these ideas as in a continuation, but I wouldn't say that they are absolutely vanished. They are probably not in power these days, but there's a possibility. So I would say we are somehow in an intermediate situation. What is to come to politics, which is my field, and what do we have to do? It is that we cannot wait to see, let me say, the other part of Russia being in power, whatever this would mean, but we have to deal with the Russia of today and with the Russian authorities of today. And there are intense questions where they want to go, and I'm not quite sure whether they are posing these questions every day to them with all alternatives. if we look on this twofold, Brzezinski has referred to the long history and the short one. As a German, I have to refer to Minister Rinkiewicz and the meeting with the German foreign minister some weeks ago, the 23rd of August, a historical date for the Baltic countries, and exactly describing what cannot be the understanding of anybody in Europe, and I include Russia, in understanding that there could be some orchestra of the big ones just thinking about cordon sanitaire or what else. This is absolutely time of the past. And I would expect a little bit much more, from Russian responsible people, that they do realize that this is a non-go, and it's impossible when the Russian chief of staff reflects about medium-range missiles and just putting them to Kaliningrad or where else. This brings me to the very precise question to the Russians, to Putin. What will he turn his face to Asia, the face of Russia, or to Europe? I do want to see this is the key question, but a little bit beyond, we have joint threats, probably in the south or where else, be terrorism and joint experiences. Why are we not able to come to joint answers? In the terms of missile defense, I regret very much that we, beyond some first steps, and just we had in Berlin a meeting of the missile defense group, invited the Russians not showing up, that there is looking on the military, political and technological capabilities, there would be a good way and good understanding to do it jointly. Missile defense see as a joint threat. This is what we do not see actually. I do not know whether this is going back to the past. I would say this is preparing for reflections for the future. Another very complicated challenge is how does a key power and a global key power answer to global crisis, regional crisis. It is absolutely not acceptable what Russia, how there's the behavior in Syria. We all know that we are not those just having a bunch of answers about questions. We all know that we have also a lot of questions what the future development in Syria will bring. But one thing I think is very sure, that how long they are we don't know, but you can count the days of Mr. Assad. And I'm referring to Syria, referring to somehow to Iran and other very hotspots of the world. I do not see an outward-oriented position of the Russian government and the Russian administration. Sometimes I have the impression that they're just looking inwards to come back to these good old days and show what they can or what they should do. This would lead, if they would continue, to some understanding which I would link to the society. Helmut Schmidt, the German Chancellor, has in the 70s sometimes said Soviet Union, Burkina Faso with missiles. I think we all and every Russian responsible cannot have the aim Nigeria with energy, something similar, because this dependence on energy is our dependence on energy. Our country depends nearly 50% on natural gas delivery from Russia. But the necessity of taking this advantage of economic possibilities for structural reforms, be it in the society and the economy, this is one of the key issues. Who could assist, who could help, who could cope, who, if not we, if not Europe, and if not the US. So I think there we are. It's just a time of reflection, and hopefully the reflection will lead to the understanding that this is not about grandeur, about missiles, but it's just about the future of their own country, which could be set quite better in cooperation instead of the understanding of having a cordon against whom, where, we don't know. Thank you.
Christian Schmidt, thank you very much. And now, if we could move on to Lilia Shevtsova of the Carnegie Endowment. And Lilia, perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit about the domestic policy issues confronting Putin and the degree to which he's got anything new and interesting to offer at this stage.
New and interesting. Well, Robert, if you allow me first a very brief comment on reflections of both Dr. Brzezinski and Dr. Schmidt, if I may. You know, I would agree with your major message, Dr. Schmidt, and I don't know whether Dr. Brzezinski is listening to this session. I would argue that Russia today found itself in one of the most dramatic periods of its existence, of its life, of its evolution. We Russian pundits, and not only Russian pundits, have so many times, remember, Robert, our times in Moscow where we've been discussing at the fork again, at the crossroads. Remember how many crossroads we had? But this time, really, there is nearly consensus according to the political spectrum, from opposition to the systemic parties, forces, and elements, that the time of the Russian matrix, of the Russian system, of the power based on one-man rule, is exhausting itself. It cannot survive for a longer time. It maybe can reproduce for a very brief period of time, but, you know, in general, it's obsolete. It's outdated. It's the system that belongs to the 16th century. And people within power, within Putin's team, they don't understand it. Simply, they do not want to be kamikaze and demonopolize power, allowing competition, and fearing to lose the power. But there is a consensus on the nature of this matrix, which is a unique thing after nearly 20 years of post-communist development. And there is understanding that Russian matrix, it's the same Russian system that has been reproducing itself, acquiring different incarnation, now post-communist incarnation, but this is the same Stalinist system. And here Dr. Brzezinski is right, and Dr. Schmidt is right, talking about nostalgia and the past. But on the other hand, and here, you know, we have this dialectical approach. On the other hand, there is still, in the Russian society, there is no strong, powerful, formidable, political and systemic existential alternative to this Russian matrix. There is no force that can present the agenda, global strategy, I'm quoting Kurt, global strategy in global era, that would have support and endorsement of the society. And Dr. Schmidt, I would argue with you, it seems to me that you said that Russians do not know where they would like to go. No. 68% of Russians know what kind of system they would like to have. The system that resembles very much the system in Germany, in Poland, in Latvia, system based on the rule of law, on competition, on honesty, on the search of dignity, on justice. The problem is how to find a way from here to there. And there is a third point to this rather bizarre picture. Russia has awoken. And today we had the beginning of the new political season. People again took to the streets in Moscow and St. Pete and some other cities. The problem is that Russia has awoken when we see that the West is experiencing a kind that I remember the US President Carter described as malaise. And malaise is much more difficult, controversial, and apparently painful than the malaise of the 70s. Yes, I heard today and yesterday that the West is entrenched. Hopefully, the West is entrenched. But as the Croatian Foreign Affairs Minister said yesterday, talking about Europe, that it lost its normative dimension. Can you imagine a normative power losing normative dimension? Dragging its feet and talking about pragmatic interests. So I don't know a single success story of transformation of the country when the West is not interested, when the West and the external circumstances are rather pathetic. And moreover, and here I would disagree with Dr. Brzezinski, who praised reset. You know, from Russia's perspective, at least from the perspective of not official Russia, maybe my friend and colleague Artem will be talking about political establishment, official political establishment here, but from the point of view of independent observers and Russia's political opposition. Reset is a form of acquiescence, of the US acquiescence, just like, I'm sorry to mention, modernization for partnership invented by our German friends and coined by the Brussels office and the EU. We consider both politics as the Western acquiescence to the Russian matrix, to the Russian political regime in times when you have problems and you know what to do with us and you are interested in Russia's status quo and stability. Because to stir waters and swamp in Russia could bring unpredictable consequences. And I would agree also with Dr. Brzezinski. I'm quoting his other article from several years now, when he criticized one administration describing its policy as the suicidal statecraft. It's a pithy phrase that he took from Arnold Toynbee. He was talking about other country, but suicidal statecraft, this is the phrase that relates very much to what is happening with the Russian matrix that has started to undermine itself. And several points, in a way of brushstroke, responding to your ironic question, Robert, about Putin's return. You were smiling, but of course, Putin never left. How would he return? But at the same time, yes, he moves from informal position of power to formal position of power, and it happens in a new country. It happens in new circumstances. It happens in the new circumstances when the most creative, dynamic, forward-looking Russian class in Moscow, in St. Pete, and other cities refused to give him legitimacy, which forces him to be the president of the traditionalist part of the country, to be the president of those who are not striving for modernization, innovation, progress, for the country that would live and survive in the 21st century. So this part of the society would like Putin to be with them in the 16th century. So in this sense, you know, Putin is in a very complicated situation. Yes, Putin's return to a different country. And I would say that Putin's return is a highly positive development. And I would argue that this is the best thing that ever happened with us recently. Because otherwise, could you imagine if Medvedev stays and remains in the Kremlin, and Dr. Brzezinski and Frau Merkel and the rest would believe that Medvedev means Medvedev's rhetoric means modernization, innovation, fight and struggle with corruption, etc. And it would allow Dr. Brzezinski to write another book with another conclusion, that Medvedev is the Russian modernizer of the 21st century. Maybe he was ironic when he said that. I hope that it was an irony. So Putin's return back means no ambivalence, no ambiguity, but simply raw truth. No makeup. Makeup is thrown away. And it's a positive development. Because, well, at least the Western policy and Western reset would be much more adequate, I hope, when our leader is losing its adequacy. Could you imagine a leader that is trying to regain popularity, being clad in white overalls and pretending to lead the cranes to the south when the whole country hopes that he will be staying there forever? Secondly, on modernization, this is topic of our panel, but I will skip this topic because it seems to me both Medvedev and Putin has solved all our doubts, well, resolved, liquidated, erased our doubts with respect of possibilities of this matrix, of this system, of this regime to do a top-down modernization. They had so much time during the last 12 years, they missed the time. And then how to provide this modernization relying upon the orthodox fundamentalists and cracking down on everything that moves on the political scene. Thirdly, about salvation. I've been listening here with bewilderment about the crisis. You've been apprehensive of crisis. You've been worried, you were concerned about your crisis. And we say in Russia, long live the crisis. Because when the top is not capable, ready, or able to start innovation, to begin changes, so scared, so fearful, so apprehensive of everything new, and when the bottom is so still frustrated, disenchanted, and bogged down in clash of egos, apparently only the crisis could stir the waters. So we are anticipating the crisis, understanding that the consequences of the crisis, both social and economic and political in Russia, could be precarious. And the final point on the moods within the country. I don't want to say that the authorities and the matrix has no political and social basis at all. Of course not. We cannot be idealistic. Recent surveys demonstrate that 22% of our population support Putin. 22% loathe Putin. And the rest, the swarm, 44, 45, 42%, still give him the flabby support. But the trend, the tendency is clear. The authorities and Putin himself is losing support. And at the same time, there's a kind of cognitive dissonance among these 42, 45%, and those who loathe our president, our leader of the cranes. 72 up to 80% believe that the power is totally corrupt. 57% believe that the government is good for nothing. 57% would like to have independent opposition. 25% say that they will take to the street if they see formidable and trustworthy opposition. And finally, 45% believe that population and the citizens should fight for their rights, and their interests do not coincide with the interest of the state. This is a different country. You are right. This is a different country. This is a different country, fed up with its past, but still apparently has to drink the bitter cup of tea until the end, until we find the solution. And we understand that the solution should be only ours, that we cannot anticipate or expect any assistance, any help, any stimulus from abroad. And in the end, we cannot promise you anything in case of success. We cannot promise you that liberal Russia will have no contradictions, tensions, or conflicts with the outside world, with the United States, with NATO, or even with the Baltic states. But in any case, I believe that we have this trap, we still don't know how to get out of this catch-22, and it seems to me that both Russia and China will be your headache for the next at least century.
100-year-long headache, Lilia. Well, that's something to look forward to. Thank you very much for 10 coruscating minutes there, I think, on the present state of Russia. And if I draw correctly from your remarks, you see a political system that is both exhausted and ossified, but trying to cope with a changing country and society that's growing increasingly impatient with it. So, Artyom Malgin, you sit inside what we might think of as the Russian intellectual and foreign policy establishment. Do you see a similar picture to the one that Lillian gives us?
Okay, let me be a little bit more optimistic, at least not so gloomy. Because I would start even from the very title of this session. It's about Russian reset, not Russian-American reset. And reset, it simply means a new start. A new start, it's always a chance. And when you start with a person whom you know, I mean you, do take an advantage of this. Yep. How much time you spend, dear colleagues, simply to learn who is Mr. Medvedev. For Putin, you don't need so much time. And that is why all your plans, all your actions could be much more, let us say, detailed, sophisticated, and eventually efficient. And this efficiency, to my mind, will grow in one case. First of all, there is no need to imagine such a big, complicated, and really very, let's say, multifaceted country as authoritarian. Probably it sounds awful what I say. It's no more authoritarian than any big country at a certain period of development, than France of 1950s, 1960s, or United States of that period, or Turkey of 1980s, 1990s. Just please simply take it into account. At the same time, in these big and complicated, very just sophisticatedly organized countries, there is no one interface. There is no one channel of interaction, and there is no one people, one person, in spite the official leader seems to be strong whom to act. Yeah. Mr. Putin is a president, elected. Probably it could be elected in a better way, according to some people, those who consider that there are different standards of elections. But still, at the same time, if you look at Russian elite and bureaucracy, not so much even on civic society, because what civic society thinks about those who are in power, it's quite remarkable, at least recently. But simply look through the media, which is not considered to be oppositional, business media, as Vedomosti, Kommersant, and other newspapers and business radio stations. And you will remarkably, it's quite evident there is a strong fight in power over influence, over business, over, let us say, closer ties with the president, prime minister. And this fight started not now, I guess it started at the very end of the previous Putin's term as president. And it simply somehow developed under this situation of so-called tandem bipolar organization of Russian power under President Medvedev and President Putin. But also I would like to remark that it was not a simple organization like this, that Medvedev, it's liberals, and Putin, it's those who are conservatives. not at all. These camps between president and prime minister, they were strongly divided in itself. And it's not so much about divisions, but about very complex character of Russian power and a strong portion of this, what usually is not quoted in connection with Russia, but a strong portion of pluralism in bureaucracy and elites. Unfortunately, our parliamentary system, party parliamentary system, doesn't reflect this pluralism. It was to this parliamentary system. But those who know how they organized, how it works, they understand what I'm talking about. And that is why, in search for, let's say, efficient interface, efficient channels of communication, there is no need to approach and to, let us say, avail this world truth, information, just confirmation only from Putin, Lavrov, and Medvedev. If you want to learn more, if you want to act better, if you want to have more efficient results, try to do through different channels. And here I don't mean opposition, but those who are in power, because the country is too big to be controlled nowadays by one person. Then, already mentioned driving force of Russia's foreign policy and probably to some extent internal politics, energy. Come on. Russia's energy sector, I guess it's the venue of the strongest fight ever. Position of Gazprom, oil community led by Rosneft, electricity and atomic energy producers, they are absolutely different. At least when it comes, for example, for the European market. And if you see properly the difference, you can, let's say, deal with them also properly, because sometimes their technical or even strategic interests perfectly fit European process, European economy changes, and that is why there is no need to demonize, to put together absolutely different factions. Look at the media, they give you ideas, who quarrels with whom, who is leader of one bunch of energy people, who is another one, how they hate each other, in spite of the fact that are all considered to be within the power, not in a position, not at Bolotnaya Square. As for the role of opposition, not civil society, I don't put I don't put on the equal foot, because civil society is also business, to my mind. Opposition, political opposition. Unfortunately, in nowadays Russia, as well as to my mind in many other countries, it's not a driving force for foreign policy. Because if you look at opposition, they have now their clear stance on foreign policy. Foreign policy is not about a positional discussion. They talk about internal politics, society, ecology, whatsoever. And that is why the deal on Russia's foreign policy through opposition is simply inefficient. Sometimes opposition unprofessional, sometimes it could be harmful for foreign policy, because Russia's opposition nowadays encompasses a strong portion of nationalists. And let me assure you that, for example, when we started this process of negotiations with our Polish colleague, I'm a member of the Russian-Polish group on difficult matters, the strongest opponent to us were not only conservatives from power, but people from communist opposition. Those who claimed to General Prosecutor Office, the presidential administration, that were going to betray Russian national interest in invading dialogues with Poland on Katyn issues, for example. Then when it comes, and it's the last portion what I wanted to say, about Russia's foreign policy priorities. First of all, to my mind, this pro-Western, pro-European stance, strategically dominates, and here I completely agree with Professor Brzezinski, strategically dominates Russia's foreign policy. Simply do compare the beginning of the previous decade, that is, say, beginning of the 2000, and nowadays. The main goals that were put at the beginning of that decade, it was entering on a full-fledged basis G8, we entered even this emerged G20. We finally assessed, and at the beginning we started real negotiations, we assessed to WTO. Now we're on the way to the accession to OECD. We're in a very strange relations nowadays with EU, but it's only because we're quite shy, both EU and Russia, to put really strategic goal to convert all these agreements about 4 dimensions to, let us say, legal terms. Because if you analyze the substance of these 4 dimensions, it clearly shows that it could be described by term that we're always afraid, association. Do compare these 4 dimensions with the association European agreements which were signed by CE countries in 1992, 1993. The substance is the same. We simply need to convert it. And it will be, by the way, a moment of truth for both of us, EU and Russia, whether we are ready to move to make this step. Nowadays, it's a certain purpose, because we need to see how WTO works in our Russia-EU relations. Probably because of WTO session, we could simply put aside some of the chapters of this agreement that we negotiate, because they are agreed or they are realized through WTO regulations. Or probably we need to add something more, because negotiations started in 2008 when we were still out of WTO. Then, when it comes to political interactions with EU and with United States, I guess what we did recently in our relations with NATO, we identified the problem where we really need to find a consensus. It's Afghanistan and, let's say, stability in Central and South Asia. And here, in the sphere where we really need each other, we cooperate. We have this military transit through Latvia, by the way. We have military NATO installations, or air transport installations, airlift installations in Ulyanovsk. We're equally afraid with NATO what is going to happen when international forces are evacuated from Afghanistan, and this tracks wars. We have interactions on or over Arab Spring. Please remember that on Libya, unfortunately, we prove solidarity with the West, and we both happen to be misled by the situation. What's happening nowadays in Libya, it's much worse than it was under Muammar Gaddafi. You want us to prove the solidarity over Syria? Do we want to have this complete extremist mess in Syria instead of this man who is, let us say, sorry for this probably slightly racist declaration, who is European by his appearance, by his habits, by his family traditions? And it's not revolution, if you like. It's counter-revolution, if we look from the point of progress. It's better to have this secular, the authoritarian. We perfectly understand it's authoritarian, sometimes dictator regimes, than to have this strange democracy that will bring us and that will enforce us, the ideas. Because you see, you already have this democracy, and all of us, in Iran, Ahmadinejad, perfectly elected at democratic elections, And he won these elections, his first term, to Mohammed Khatami, who was much more pro-European, by the way. So if you want to have this kind of democracies, we need to cooperate strongly. But fortunately, Russia first found that this cooperation could be harmful, and that is why our position over Syria is slightly different than our position on Libya. As for Eurasian Union, it's strange. When you look at Russian media, nearly no one uses this term. Eurasian Union, Евразийский Союз. It's once sounded in this pre-election article of Mr. Putin, and then it somehow exists. But everyone talks about customs union, a very real thing that works and in economic, social relations between Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. You perfectly know that there is a strong discussion within Russia itself whether Eurasian Union has a chance to kill customs union, because we know, if we analyze all these integration efforts in the post-Soviet areas, when we start inventing something premature and political, then this premature and political kills already something that works in the sphere of economy. And that is why many business, economic, and foreign policy experts, they're quite afraid of premature Eurasian Union. Though, as a slogan for election campaign, it was a perfect slogan, and it helped Putin to grab a part of voters. And one last point. But even when we talk about customs/Eurasian Union, about our cooperation with China in energy sphere, about our special relations with Central Asia and so on, republics, we always argue these relations. We always somehow mention EU, that it's not because we won't diminish our context with the EU, that it's not because we want to counterbalance. That is probably, it's psychologically. Yeah? Even in explanation of Eurasian Union, even in this famous article, Putin wanted to say, and he said that he brought some ideas of how to bring these unions. So psychologically, European Union, somehow is inside even these Asian-oriented, Asia-aimed projects. That should be remarkable, that it proves, let's say, very strong, sometimes unconscious, if you like, European identity of Russia.
Artyom Malgin, thank you. And very interesting opposition there of views between Lilia Shevtsova, who sees a political system which is not only exhausted but can be seen to be exhausted, and Artyom Malgin, who sees, on the contrary, a system that's in the process of evolving through and very possibly beyond authoritarianism, and which meanwhile is pursuing some fairly conventional strategic goals. So, Bobo, if you'd like to speak for 5 to 10 minutes before we go to the room for questions.
Well, thank you, Robert. I'm going to try and answer 4 questions. And question number 1 is, what is the state of Russian foreign policy today, now that Putin has returned to the presidency? Now, it seems to me that Russia's fortunes in a very rapidly changing global context depend fundamentally on 2 things. First is the ability to modernize at home, and the second is the ability to develop functional, broadly cooperative relations with the United States and with Europe. Picking up on a point that Christian Schmidt made, there's a lot of talk about a turn to the east. But for Russia, really, there is no Asian or Eurasian alternative. I think that an unreformed, stagnating Russia is singularly ill-equipped to adapt to the challenges of a postmodern century. But, and this is where we pick up on Zbigniew Brzezinski's point about strategic unreality, so far the Putin regime has shown no real sign of grasping these realities. It believes that Russia is actually the prime beneficiary of the decline of the West and the so-called global shift in power to the East. It feels vindicated by recent events and trends. And so, in fact, the principal lesson that it has drawn from recent years is not the need for reinvention, but the need for reaffirmation. Because fundamentally, the core principles and instincts of Russian foreign policy remain unchanged. And what are they? It's a neo-Hobbesian view of the world in which the strong thrive and, as Putin himself has said, the weak get beaten. It is a world in which the great powers dominate the international system. And of course, it's a world in which Russia is not only an indispensable international power, a great power, a world power, but an independent center of global power. Second question. Well, how will Russia's relations with the United States and Europe evolve, given the state of Russian foreign policy now that Putin has come back as president? I think the strengthening of domestic and foreign policy trends in Russia foreshadow an extended period of drift in Russia's relations with the West. Because, for one thing, the lack of modernization in Russia means that there is much less scope for cooperation. There are fewer areas of common interest. It also means, inevitably, that the attention of policymakers shifts not from areas of potential convergence or cooperation, but to areas of difference. It means also that policy making on all sides becomes increasingly reactive, an exercise in firefighting, crisis management, crisis avoidance. If I break it down, let's have a look at Russia-US interaction. I believe that Russia-US interaction is in a kind of post-reset period. It's a period, what I would call, mutually assured stagnation. This is because the bilateral agenda will become increasingly dominated by differences, whether it's on missile defense, Syria, Magnitsky, you name it, you can find loads of differences. And I think also we have a situation where the illusion of consensus, the spell of consensus, has been dispelled. The idea that you pretend to agree with us and we pretend to believe you. Now, I don't think that the stagnation of the relationship is necessarily going to lead to an early crisis. But I do think that it significantly increases the risks of a structurally adversarial relationship over time. Because a Russia that feels pessimistic about the likelihood of worthwhile cooperation with the United States will, I think, inevitably think, well, we need to remind Washington that we are a significant international actor. And in that sense, I think they'll follow Machiavelli's precept. It's better to be disliked than to be ignored. And so that means it could strengthen its military presence in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It could feel tempted to exert greater pressure on its neighbors. And it may well seek to undermine American interests wherever possible. Okay, Zbigniew Brzezinski really put the emphasis on Russia-Europe relations. But unfortunately here, I don't think that the outlook is any more promising. Because, let's cut to the chase here. Russia looks at Europe as a disorganized rabble, as a collection of states, very loose collection of fragmentary states of completely different levels of power and influence and standing, at least as viewed from Moscow. So it means that this has predisposed Moscow to a much more conditional approach to Europe. It means that it's engaging with what it sees as important European powers, the classic continental European powers. In first place, Germany, but also France. at the expense of cooperation with the EU and other European institutions. And just a quick comment on the Russia-EU strategic partnership. I see this strategic partnership as neither strategic nor partnership. What's crucial here is that the Putin regime doesn't even really care about the illusion of normative convergence. Because ultimately, it doesn't want normative convergence with Europe. It wants normative acquiescence by Europe. Now, people say, well, Russia will inevitably focus on Europe. But I beg to differ. I think that Putin's vision is not a regional vision, it's a global vision of Russia as a global power. And this means that the United States, not Europe, will remain the main strategic benchmark. And we also need to remember that Russian strategic culture is very firmly rooted in the primacy of hard power. And this is precisely where Europe is weakest. And an enfeebled and an unconfident Europe is frankly not an especially attractive partner for Moscow these days. So rather like with the United States, the principal danger that I see in Russia-Europe interaction, again, is not crisis, but it's growing mutual indifference. Because in Russia, as Lilia has pointed out, few believe in a partnership for modernization. And frankly, in Europe, interest in Russia is at a 20-year low. Now, the third question is, well, what happens if we move from this sort of period of stagnation to one where there's increasing authoritarianism or maybe increasing instability, chaos? Well, let's start off with authoritarianism. I think that growing authoritarianism in Russia will aggravate relations between Russia and the West. And I think we've had a little bit of a taster here already with the adverse Western reaction to Putin's return. Some people say, well, can't you have a relationship with Russia like you would with China or Saudi Arabia? You effectively trade economic and security cooperation in exchange for sort of so-called non-interference in domestic affairs. Sort of like China and Saudi Arabia, as I said. Now, the problem with this, I see, quite apart from its moral dubiousness, is that the United States and Europe are unlikely just to shrug off the emergence of an increasingly authoritarian Russia. Because I think it's one thing to kind of suspend disbelief and pretend somehow, hope somehow, that Putin is interested in modernization and democratization. And it's quite another to have any remaining illusions crushed. I think also that an authoritarian regime, in my opinion, is likely to face mounting economic and social problems for many of the reasons that Lilia outlined. And I think just such an authoritarian regime would naturally feel inclined to seek external scapegoats. In fact, we have clear precedent for that in recent months. And it might compensate with confrontational behavior, particularly towards the United States. Well, what happens if the regime collapses, or really we have a situation of, real chaos? Well, I think the future of Russia's relations with the West depends, obviously, on what emerges. But even here, I'm not hugely optimistic, because it seems to me that Western governments would look to stay out as much as possible, because it's a real can of worms. There's 20 years of Russia fatigue. The chances of a successful intervention or influence are frankly minimal. Fourth question, and I really want to, can we hope for anything better? Well, as an Australian, I like to see the sunny side of life, and I think there is a chance. Now, while I take Lilia's point that a liberal Russia could still have major disagreements with the United States, with Europe, with other countries, I think that's absolutely right. Nevertheless, the chances are better if there is even an imperfect but relatively comprehensive modernization, liberalization in Russia. And there are three mutually reinforcing elements here. The first is that even a limited convergence of values would help build a certain degree of confidence. It would enable the policy differences that you undoubtedly still have to be better managed, to be more easily managed. Second, that serious political, economic and social reforms would actually give greater opportunity for substance in these, at the moment, nominal partnerships for modernization. And I think third, a modernizing, a more liberal Russia might be more flexible, might be more constructive on some international issues. However, we shouldn't get our hopes up too much. I think, although Zbigniew Brzezinski is probably right that the European direction is the way for Russia to go in the long term, I think this is going to be a very extended process. And I think in the meantime, the Putin regime's approach to the United States, to the EU, will be one of selective or a la carte engagement. And that means maximizing it, that is, the elite's own access to the West. That means resisting the importation of subversive Western ideas into Russia. And it means preserving the existing system of power relations in the country. In effect, what the Putin regime is looking for is a combination of Western-style consumerism and Eastern-style obedience, or rather, Louis Vuitton without the normative baggage. Leave it on.
Bobo, thank you. Now, excellent remarks, I think, from all of our speakers. So first of all, a round of applause. Okay, and time is limited. Let's take questions in groups of three. So, sir, yes, please.
Thank you very much. We have been speaking here about, let's say, weaknesses of Russia very much. And I would like to speak a little bit about the strengths of Russia. And we associate usually Russia very much with a hard power. But what about Russian soft power? Even if somebody compares the system with the 16th century or so, obviously also this might appeal certain amount of population even in Latvia. And once we are watching Russia today, once especially those people who watch more in Latvia Russian TV channels, we can see that if we would ask, according to sociology here, there would be quite a big amount of people who would say, you know, I am ready to change Latvia for Russia. So we also heard, according to the Jamestown Foundation, that lately Putin has been ordering a few sociological researches, particularly in Moldova, Ukraine, and Latvia, about not why, but how to influence elites, how to influence economics, how to portray Russia better, and local, let's say, elites and Western orientations worse. We also saw the influence of Russian-speaking media from Russia during our internal political events, either referendums or elections. So obviously, even if we know the tiger has a paws with iron nails, sometimes it can take those nails in, and obviously it has an appeal. So what do you think about the role today of this soft power of Russia, especially towards the countries closer to its border, and why do you think it is getting a more systematic, concentrated and formulated approach than, for instance, 5 years ago? Thank you.
And at the back there, I think. Ah, yes, President Ilves.
First, a quick remark. I don't think bribery is soft power, and that's why I disagree with that. I mean, that's not soft power as Nye described it. It's Coca-Cola, Mac computers, not bribery of $20 million, for example. But my question is about the reset back of the week. And the reset back of the week is, which really leads me to the question, the statement by the esteemed vice rector, is that, you know, Gazprom, Rosneft, as examples of democracy, when they're under investigation for well, basically violating the antitrust regulations of the EU. The first response by Chisov was, well, maybe we can cut a deal, more or less. And then this was followed up by Putin basically issuing an ukaz forbidding any kind of cooperation with the investigation of the antitrust nature of gas sales to Europe. Now, rule of law is actually going to, I argue, is where really the crux is going to come. I mean, you can't do a Pussy Riot trial with the European Commission. Sorry, it doesn't work. And I guess Alan here probably can give you all the bloody details of it, but I think this is a very serious issue. And even countries that were loath to investigate, we don't have to mention them, but the big ones, were loath to investigate this whole issue, have now come behind the Commission. And the Commission, I mean, they find Microsoft for far less egregious antitrust actions than with gas. Where's that going to go with EU relations? And since we have both Russians and EU people, that maybe some thoughts on rule of law, reset back Gazprom. And I have to say one more time, I can hardly think of a country that pays off chancellors and ex-prime ministers as shining examples of democracy in action.
Right, and a third question from you at the front, sir.
Thank you. I have thought for a long time, and I think I said it here last year, that reset is a bad metaphor in this context. We do not need a new start, we need a new program. And that would comprise on NATO's side a self-critical acknowledgement of our part of the responsibility for the deterioration of the relationship with Russia over 15 years. And on Russia's side, it would require new thinking in security policy. And for both sides, I could give a couple of examples, which of course I will not do here. And both sides together must overcome zero-sum thinking in security policy, where allegedly one side can only gain at the expense of the other. I think, according to Brzezinski, I'm talking about the long term here. But I think that we lost a very important opportunity by not sensibly reacting to the Medvedev proposal a couple of years ago, which would have given the opportunity to forcefully make all these points, pushing or convincing, rather, or making these arguments about cooperative as opposed to confrontational policy. And incidentally, this would have included also the demand that Moscow contribute actively to the reassurance of its small neighbors instead of making them nervous. The question is, would you comment on that?
I'm rather inclined to agree with you that reset doesn't seem quite the word. Perhaps we should revert to the creative American mistranslation of 2009 and go for overload, yes, which would make this panel called Russian Overload, Putin Returns. Now, Christian Schmidt, would you like to go first to any of those three questions? And I think particularly the first from Minister Pabriks about soft power. How do you evaluate the resilience of Russian soft power?
As I do not see in Germany a lot of impact of soft power. Maybe this is quite another experience than in your country. The only Russian soft power is now just to be actual, and probably you know what I'm referring to now, as we have a soccer game with the biggest fan of a German soccer team, Henrik Kissinger, sitting in Fürth against Schalke 04, sponsored by Gazprom. So not Kissinger's team, but the opposite. So, and Kissinger hopefully will win. There is a lot of less of knowledge about the Russian society and the developments. Very interesting what you reported about polls, about figures and positions. And our country in particular can take this for a large part of Europe. Oscillates the view on Russia between autocracy and developing civil society. Come back to the word civil society, and there's no attractivity for any soft power structure. If I compare to the other, should I say, other complicated big power, China, there's some attractivity about the economic success being put in opposition to the suppression of the political system and freedom. But we do not see where does Russia want to go to. This is, I think, one of the key issues and a question to the Russian society itself. And I have not fully got Brzezinski's optimism about the long term. I do not see a stringent development to answers to all these questions we posed. We all see that there is there are questions, reflections, but where does it go to? Probably we have to wait after the presidency of Putin. We have to try on our side again and again, keeping in mind what Klaus Wittmann just referred to, starting with the enlargement of NATO, I suppose, and some other questions, that we are prepared for this cooperative approach. But honestly, Medvedev's approach was, we were, I think, right to put the question how deep this approach really is embedded in Russian policy. And it was not. If it would have been, we would have seen that Putin would have repeated this. And as he never has been off, I would really wait for him to say into this and have not seen anything. Maybe some sentence to Syria and Libya. This describes a little bit the problem. We are not in a tit-for-tat or retaliation situation. Maybe that there was not a concise approach to the Libyan case and the, should I say, misunderstandings. My country also has had some difficulties with Libya. But could this anyhow give an argument now in a case where we have a civil war in a country, not working on getting this crisis settled and this conflict settled? So we can observe this in several cases, that there is because you did not, we do not. And this seems for me a very simple way of defining foreign policy. And I'm just waiting to get more interesting arguments. It is not understandable when the Russian foreign minister kids about some ideas, reflections, whether there could be sometimes a place necessary to give Assad a place for asylum. Could be. I'm coming from a country where a wall has fallen down. Probably also Mr. Assad is part of history, the past of history. And we did not see that there is any approach to understanding. So this is what I really see as the key problem, that there seems not to be a preparedness to change to cooperative it would be on the Russian side now just to show that, say, okay, we cope with you. Maybe we don't agree with you. Absolutely. This won't be the case in each situation. But we have a proposal. I do not see a proposal, especially coming back to Syria, which is not only, sorry to say this, a destructive one. And it is a destructive one these days.
Okay. Artyom, I think President Ilves's question about the rule of law was directed pretty directly at you. So,
President Alves, comment, but,
to be frank, I see no legal problems in this case. This ukaz doesn't say that the Russian companies prohibited to cooperate with anti-monopoly bodies of the European Union. But first, and this could be resolved in any country for any state-owned or semi-owned or with state shares, these countries should consult one of the main shareholder. In Russian case, in case of Gazprom, it's state. So no infringement of European or international law. It's simply additional conditions for Russian internal legal regulation and even administrative regulation. And it's not simply, and you can impose sanctions if a Russian company stops to cooperate with anti-monopoly bodies of EU. You can do it perfectly if something appears in Russian regulation, or even more, if it appears in Russian legal practice, in Russian legal behavior of the Russian companies. But it's simply because that changes, the decree that changes or simply gives additional details how to behave in this crisis situation. As for Minister's question about Russian soft power, as I remarked it here at this monitor, strange that this Russian soft power, what we strongly criticize in our country, at least means of soft power, we consider them insufficient, old-fashioned, inefficient, and so on. That you remark them here, probably because recently appeared a few new so-called public diplomacy institutions as Russian Council on Foreign Affairs, Russian Gorchakov Foundation, which is still at the beginning of its, Gorchakov Foundation, at the beginning of its activity, and probably because of reforms of Россотрудничество, this organization that should deal with Russian state-sponsored soft power abroad. But when it comes to soft power, I guess there is really objective soft power, and it's somehow pursued or could be realized in three ways. First, it's attractiveness of Russian market, if we include economic power into soft power. Attractiveness of the market, attractiveness of the life level, but it's not for Latvia, I guess, but for some of former Soviet republics, and we have numerous millions of migrants from these countries. It's either seasonal migration or those who want to resettle. And the third one, it's Russian language, and at least this kind of common heritage, but not in an ideological way dealt with this factor. When you simply choose the country where to move, to live better, you choose the country where you feel, let us say, in a more convenient way. And sure, for Tajiks, Azeris, Armenians, many other of those who lived in former Soviet Union, it's much easier to learn, to polish the Russian language, those who already didn't study at school, than English, German, or French. It's three ways of three means of Russian soft power, which objectively exist.
Artyom, could I just pause you there for a second, because we can easily spill over beyond 6 o'clock for a few more minutes and a few more questions, but Lilia Shevtsova can't because she has a plane to get. So, Lilia, with 6 o'clock coming up, are there any final points you'd like to make either on the issue of the rule of law or soft power while you can?
Thank you, Robert. If I may, soft power reflects the nature of the state and the nature of the regime and the system. And I would agree with President Ilves. So my comment will be a variation of his comment. You can't call the traditional quote-unquote soft power what is propaganda, cooptation, and bribery. But the question is, from my side to you, Minister, why do you think the European political leaders, former leaders, and maybe future leaders, like Mr. Schroeder, Mr. Lipponen, Mr. Lord Robertson, Mr. Berlusconi, so are easily seduced by the Russian soft power and serve on the board of the most non-transparent companies? Why your journalists, pundits, experts, intellectuals are waiting nearly for the whole year, desperately for an invitation from the Kremlin, and accept the invitation to take part in the Valdai meeting at the dinners with the president, national leader, former leader, future leader, and ask them the prearranged questions. So it's the question to you, why the Western community and the best of the best, the cream of the cream apparently, are so easily seduced and become object of the Russian soft power. So this is the ball on your court. And it seems to me the president has raised very important issues on the antitrust investigation of Gazprom, which can lead nowhere because we know how Brussels loves the Russian soft power. But in fact, the attempt is absolutely amazing, together with the attempt of the US Congress failed for the time being. And I'm looking at Sandy Verzbo and dreaming that maybe he will give us an answer whether the Congress will adopt the Magnitsky Act, at least this year. But these two things are revelation. Magnitsky Act and this investigation are the first attempts on the part of the Western elites to constrain the soft power of the Russian corrupted state. And I hope that you will succeed.
Thank you. Now let's bring in one more question or comment from the back there, and then you, Robert, sir, and yes.
Robert,
yes.
Can I get back on soft power just very quickly?
Oh yes, you're an object of soft power, aren't you? You're a member of the Valdai discussion group.
Just very quickly, I would disagree with the proposition that Russia is any kind of significant soft power. If we look at Russian soft power in any corner of the world, virtually, it is in a weaker position today than at any time in the last 20 years. Consider the Russian soft power in Europe? No. Russian soft power in the Asia-Pacific region? Absolutely not. Russian soft power in the United States? Russian soft power in the former Soviet republics? No. I think Russian influence in really right across the world is far lower now than it has ever been. There might be pockets of exceptions, but really we are talking about a general decline, and that's the important point. Now, I believe that Russia can be a global power again. But in order for Russia to be a global power, it needs to understand three things. First, hard power is increasingly unimportant. It's still important, of course, but soft power is the way forward. Unless we sort of think, well, hold on, the world's changing, Europe's in relative decline, if not absolute decline. Think about the rise of China. China's rise is all about the primacy of soft power over hard power. China is a rubbish hard power. The last war it fought, it got beaten by Vietnam in 1979. And yet, what we've seen over the last 30 years is the extraordinary rise of China on the back of soft power. So Russia needs to understand the Chinese lesson, but not in the way it normally understands that Chinese lesson. The second thing is that Russia needs to understand that even if hard power were what it was all about, it's rubbish at hard power. Its hard power capabilities are increasingly unimportant, increasingly insignificant. And the third aspect is that Russia has enormous but untapped soft power potential. Let's imagine, for its sake, of argument. A Russia that was not a Western liberal democracy, but more liberal, more modern, more democratic than it is today. Just what an extraordinary normative example it would be to the vast array of neighbors that it has. I think Russia, that's just one example. There are lots of other areas where Russia, a modernized Russia, would actually be able to export something more than energy and other natural resources. So really the way for Russia to become a global power again is to reinvent itself as a global soft power. Now obviously that's really difficult to do, given that sort of Russian strategic culture really has no tradition of that. But ultimately it is the only way.
Trick would be to take some lessons from Pussy Riot, who seem to have mastered soft power globally. Now, let's try that again. So, you, sir, at the back there.
Bartek Nowak from Poland. First, do you really believe that for the first time in Russian history they may happen the bottom-up modernization? Okay. Second, would you please comment on the recent long-term budgetary planning, which assumes enormous increase in military expenditure? And third, during the morning session we are talking about NATO open door policy and nobody mentioned Georgia. And my a little bit provocative question, do you think that for Russia the case of Georgia may be simply an unfinished business? Thank you.
Yeah. And a question from you.
My question is about about Gazprom and the Russian energy system. I mean, from an energy perspective, what you see increasingly is the sense of doom that a lot of energy analysts fear about Russia. I mean, it's a triple doom of the increasing liquidity on global mass markets, partly because of shale gas, and I think for Russia, even more importantly, shale oil. Is a prospect within I would think in a 5-year period of a significant push down in oil prices, and it's staying there for some time. It's then the amount of money. The IEA had a huge report last year on the Russian energy markets, $2 trillion by 2035 to actually replace most of the production for oil and gas. And the other problem caused by the shale gas revolution is that the fundamental switch, so that instead of capital chasing resources, now resources chase capital. And if you're in a dysfunctional, corrupt state with no rule of law, who's going to give you the money when the money can go elsewhere and more profitably and easily extract his revenues?
Right. Thank you. And sir, I think you had a question over there. I saw a raised hand, yes? Microphone?
If you look at your crystal ball, do you see a fourth-term Putin presidency? And if so, will he carry Medvedev with him?
Right. We're over time, so I think that's a very, very fine place on which to rest for some final comments and a very good way of putting it in perspective. Christian, are we going to get to a fourth term, and if so, what will it bring?
Fourth term. Which one, as Prime Minister or President? I would not. Okay, I could not imagine that one continues this game for more terms. Maybe, okay, this is a crystal ball, and we don't know. But let me just come to Gazprom. And having heard that there are a lot of people attracted to cope with Gazprom and other parts of this energy and other sectors and Russia. President Alves has left already, but I would assure him that there are not only people just being on the payroll of Gazprom in Western Europe, and this is where I come to the understanding description that the Russia tends to become on the same level as the US to be a global player. If they, including the guys from Gazprom, would think strategically, they would have to focus on Europe. There's no dependence of America from Russian gas, but there's a dependence in Europe, and they misperformed in just showing that they are linking in a way politics and influence, referring to Ukraine and other places, with their means and tools of energy policy, that reliability was under fire. So if I would be, and what would I do? Taking shoes of those one, probably advising strategic people in Gazprom, would say, I would like to have something like soft power more in Europe. But this would lead to a need of reliability, assertiveness, and the preparedness of coming to some understanding of open economic and political structures. So this is the key issue. So I do not see that these reflections have been set, and what is the answer from the European side? A lot of efforts to get less dependence on Russian energy support. This would be the end, will be the end of this crystal ball surroundings in the fourth term.
Right, so intervention here at the front.
Hello, Veikos Police, Latvian MOD. I have a question to Mr. Malgin. You mentioned a very good example that NATO has agreed with Russia on Ulyanovsk about the transiting point. My question is, why is it still so negative? Why NATO has such a negative image in Russian media? And would it not be helped if, for example, Russian government or President himself at least would have some media pronouncement that, yes, we are cooperating with the NATO and it is beneficial to Russia? Thank you.
Okay, I want to give Artyom the last word. So, Bobo, a few things up in the air right now. There's defence spending, Georgia, Gazprom, fourth term. Any of those you'd like to speak to while we've got a couple of minutes?
Okay, look, really interesting questions. Let's start off with bottom-up modernisation. One of the things that always amuses me is when Russians talk about the China model as a sort of a dirigist state, grand strategic planning, gradual reform, and all that. In fact, the China model could hardly be more different than what Putin has in mind. The China model is precisely about bottom-up modernization. For example, think about small and medium-sized enterprises. SMEs in China account for 65% of GDP and 80% of employment. In Russia, the figures are basically 20 and 20. It's a complete. So the Chinese themselves, the authoritarian Chinese, have understood the value of bottom-up modernization. And the clever thing that the Chinese Communist Party has done is to essentially, most of the time, get out of the way of socio-economic progress. Not always, but it's done much better than Russia. Second, budgetary planning. Basically, it shows that Putin has not yet got the message about soft power. That's quite clear. He thinks he can, in a sense, reinvent the wheel. But there is a problem here, because the increases in defense spending could end up being one of the causes of the Putin regime's collapse. If we cast our mind back to 20 or so years ago, let's think you have unsustainable rises in defense spending. You have falling energy and commodity prices, the kind that Alan Riley's spoken about. You have fissures, splits within the elite. And you have the anesthetization of the general population, which no longer cares whether the regime lives or dies. So these are some of the causes. So ultimately, what could happen is that accelerated defense spending could actually be one of the reasons for the regime's downfall, in sort of a cruel irony. And then Georgia, unfinished business. No, I don't think that Putin wants to reconquer the whole of Georgia. I don't think it's worth it for him. In fact, I think he's quite comfortable in having Saakashvili still in power. Because as long as Saakashvili is still in Tbilisi, he will be able to say to the Americans, to the Europeans, look, you've got this slightly irrational individual in power. you don't really want to go there. So it's actually, whereas if you actually had a leader a Georgian leader that was able to rebuild closer relations, much greater credibility in Western countries, then I think that would be harder to do. Now, just very quickly...
By the way, could I pause you there, just because we've got a hard time constraint, and I'd really like to give Artyom a minute.
Can I just say about the fourth term?
Let's have
Do say about the fourth term, because I'm not going to deliberate on this.
I don't think Putin will go for the fourth term. I think it's going to be unsustainable. I think he's going to look for a graceful exit. The question is not the exit, but the grace. How do you do it? Because where would he go? And I think he would be hoping, ironically, for a greater rule of law Russia, so that at least he could hold on to what he has. But I think a fourth term is unsustainable.
Okay, Artyom, can we give you 1 minute, please?
As for NATO, when there is a pretext, all these pro-NATO stances, they're always pronounced. Do look through addresses, official addresses to the State Duma and Senate, these yearly addresses. Do look at the articles, but at the same, when there is a pretext to pronounce against NATO enlargement, it's also pronounced. And what media do you mean? I don't think that Russian media is so much obsessed with foreign policy. If you look at daily newspapers, there is only one which professionally deals with foreign policy, or 1.5. It's Независимая and Российская Газета. The rest influential, really all Russian media papers, it's Ведомости, this joint venture of Wall Street Journal and Financial Times and Kommersant. They don't care about NATO at all. So what media, then internet is completely pluralistic. As for TV, sure, it's reserved for the state, but it's also reserved, sorry for such a term, for grassroots, and they don't care about NATO. What do you mean, how to pronounce? As for Gazprom, look, I guess we're at the point in our internal economic discussion, business discussion, at the point of really strong Gazprom reforms, because Gazprom faces strong economic opposition from different sectors, first of all of oil and then coal producers, because as for gas and coal, they compete in the sphere of electricity. And sure, these, I don't mean even companies, but two other energy sectors, they are not going to let Gazprom be further monopolist player in the Russian market. And the strongest part of this fight is over pipelines. And sure, Gazprom should care about the diminishing of its portion on the European gas market, which is absolutely objective. Because diversification of European gas markets started not because of Ukraine, not because so much of Belarus, but started immediately after oil crisis in 1974, and Gazprom appeared in Europe because of this crisis. And then further diversification, they lead to further invitations to other sources, other companies. And once Gazprom will find its niche and its portion in Europe, and this diminished, now they already diminished portion, is closer to what Gazprom could really sell and you could really buy in Europe. So Gazprom should not, German colleague has disappeared, should not, let us say, treat it so much strategically in terms of our relations with US, because it's not something forever. As for military budget planning and long-standing, it's one more perfect example. Where is our Polish colleague still there? No. Okay. Yeah, I like this way to ask the question and then to disappear.
Okay, Artyom, can we pause it there, because we really are coming down now to the...
Simply to let you compare. I guess here there are a lot of who perfectly know about the figures about U.S. military budget. Here's discussion about $22 billion for a provisional period. And at the same time, this small, the Russian and sure to the American scale, sum of money provoked strongest discussion, even between Prime Minister and President on the state TV, between Minister of Defense and Prime Minister, between different vice ministers. Yeah? It once again shows that it's not such a simplistic figure, authoritarian, vertical power, or something like this. It's much more complicated. And sure, this budgetary planning, even if we afford this $22 billion, it won't undermine Russia. Sure, it will undermine some parts of Russian economy, social sphere, where they could be taken out, but not the whole socio-economic system of Russia. It's nothing. So that is all.
Okay,
Not to keep you
thank
long.
you very much. And I think we're going to have to stop there because we've got to get on, and we can always resume at the reception at 8 o'clock. So let's have a round of applause for our speakers present and absent. And I believe that Toms Baumanis has a couple of words for us before we disperse.
Now, as we do recall, 2 days of conference panels, I think they were too long, and there are obvious reasons for that. They also were interesting and lively and challenging, thanks to the panel and all of the rest panelists for being provocative and very interested into subjects. I hope there are thoughts and ideas you can take back home. Our idea is that we will hold the annual RIG conference until Latvian EU presidency in 2015 at least, so you're welcome back. Only teams can put event of this scale together, and here we do have a team working for you. And this team includes both institutions and individuals. You can see institutions here, and I want to name individuals, including Minister Inkevich, Minister Publics, who has left, Craig Kennedy, and LATO organizational staff, Sandis, Ines, Katrina, Zane, Arvils, and all others. And a special thanks to volunteers who helped a lot to make your stay here comfortable. So I am very thankful for your patience and for being with us here. I hope to see you in 2 hours at the Minister's reception. And once again, thanks a lot for being with us, and see you next year.